to Interiority and the Lasallian Mission, originally recorded for the Brother Luke Salm Religious Education Workshop on October 19th, 2020. My name is Jaime Longo, and this is my passion project, Purposeful Pedagogy for Transformative Teaching. I am a composition scholar, an educational developer, an accidental instructional design evangelist as a result of that educational developing, and a legacy Lasallian for my time as a student at LaSalle University through many years of working as a staff member and faculty member at LaSalle University. And I'm really pleased to be finding ways to continue my connections to the Lasallian world, as it has really shaped and developed me into the person that I am today. Before we begin, let us take a moment to remember that we are in God's holy presence. Today's discussion is going to look at interiority from a number of different directions and try to explore why interiority can help us as contemporary Lasallians both connect to some foundational words and texts and methods, but also to navigate our way through our 21st century world today. So we'll cover some whys for interiority and investigate the foundational texts in the Lasallian tradition and what Jean-Baptiste de Lassalle's 3 movements for interiority looked like as part of his method. But we'll also take a look at more contemporary approaches to interiority through connection to community and through our 21st century pedagogy. Before we look into the how of interiority as proposed by Jean-Baptiste de Lassalle, we should really begin by asking ourselves why interiority and why interiority now? In our 24/7, 365 world, especially one as filled with tension and uncertainty as 2020 has been, purposefully making time for interiority is even more important than ever. Working remotely means that our work-life balance blurs even more than before. And our families, our students' families are all experiencing an unprecedented level of stress. Hybrid and fully remote teaching mean that even those of us who are experienced Lasallian educators with strong professional learning networks and well-earned decisional capital, we're all scrambling to invent new methods of teaching from scratch. Lasallian teaching often focuses on the critical importance of association and the value of building and maintaining a learning community that is united in our shared mission. We sometimes talk less about de Lassalle's emphasis on interior reflection, but interiority can provide the fodder for our associative interaction, as well as a space to process our associative inspirations and challenges like the ones that we are navigating in our classrooms right now. In his introduction to the collected meditations, Brother Jean-Guy Rodrigue notes that de Lassalle encourages the brothers to live in a constant search for the living God, for his will in their life, for the reign of God that is yet to come. He calls them to recognize each day the intervention of the Lord in their life, and by an interior effort to live with an awareness of the presence of God. This interior effort is essential to the purpose of the Institute, that is, the work of evangelization. So what undergirds all of our work as Lasallian educators is this focus on evangelization. And undergirding that even farther is our relationship as an educator with God. De Lassalle had a focus in his work on spiritual interiority, of course, which we see in explanation for the method of interior prayer, in meditations for Sundays and feast days, and in meditations for the time of retreat. He used those texts to guide the early brothers through spiritual reflection including the application of the spiritual to daily living. And we see that today in the writing of contemporary brothers, like Brother William Mann, who emphasizes that the attitude and practice of interiority was, according to de La Salle, to be looked at upon as the first and principle of our daily activities. That being interior first is what gives us the space to then go out and do the other work of being the Lasallian educator. Silent but guided contemplation of divine mysteries is central to de La Salle's method for interiority. He wrote, "We learn to speak to God only by listening to him. For to know how to speak to God and to converse with him can only come from God, who has his own language." Making that space for interiority, creating that dialogue space with God, because it is meant to be a dialogue, a two-way conversation, not a one-way conversation, either with us monologuing to God or even with God monologuing to us. It's meant to be that conversational element of God in union with the Spirit. The interiority, according to de La Salle, is a kind of relationship with God that dwells in the depths of our hearts. As part of this reflection, which can be on gospel readings or other scriptures, it can be on the guided types of texts that de La Salle puts together in his meditations, de La Salle also emphasized contemplation of the lives of the saints to provide his brothers with role models and real world applications. So in the meditations, he spends time breaking down, in this real world situation that the saint focused, here's how they use their interiority, here's how they use their reflection, here's how they use their conversation with God to make their decision about how to respond. And that, I think, is a really critical pivot point for us as Lasallian educators. De La Salle's approach included instruction in what I would call practical interiority. So that spiritual component is central. It is absolutely at the heart of what it means to be a Lasallian educator, but it's not only spiritual. It's not only the dialogue with God, it's what we do with the dialogue with God. In some meditations, as well as in pedagogical resources like Conduct of the Christian Schools and the writings that Brother Agathon eventually compiled into the 12 Virtues of the Good Teacher, de La Salle modeled a form of practical pedagogical interiority, helping the early brothers learn from their teaching experiences to build what we might now call decisional capital. Decisional capital is the expertise that we build over time by reflecting on our experiences, which allows us to make quicker, better decisions, even under pressure, as we accumulate additional experience. Decisional capital also helps us to automate consistent decisions or behaviors, which frees up our cognitive capacity so we can focus more deeply on new issues or particularly thorny problems. For a really great touchstone example of decisional capital, think about a new driver versus an experienced driver. So the first time you're learning to drive a car, you have to consciously think through every single decision that you're making. But once you're an experienced driver, many of those decisions are automated and we are focusing on new problems or on challenges that come up while we are driving, not the regular experiences of putting on a turn signal or when and how to brake and all of those kinds of decisions. And the same thing is true of our teaching. As we develop more experience as teachers, many of our decisions become a little bit more automated, not in a bad way, as if we're on autopilot, but so that we can use our cognitive capacity to focus on the students in front of us and the challenges and successes that they're having in their daily lives, and not in the decision about whether we're going to let somebody use a pencil sharpener or where in the classroom you want to stand. To help early brothers develop their decisional interiority, de La Salle encouraged them to think deeply about their classroom management, about their disciplinary practices, about their lesson planning, about their mentoring of students, but also their connections with students' families. That's why Conduct of the Christian Schools is so detailed in its descriptions of what one should do every moment of every day. At 8:01, do this. At 8:02, do this. At 8:03, do this. If you have this kind of disciplinary situation with a student, run through this set of questions to determine what the appropriate response is to that student. That's the kind of guidance that a novice needs, someone who has never done this before. And that, of course, is who he was writing for. But an experienced teacher has built all of the decisional capital to have many of those decisions automated, and to be able to pivot on a dime when there is a new or particularly thorny challenge that arises and disrupts what would be the automated focus of the day. Both forms of interiority are critical to De La Salle's approach, and they remain critical for us today. And so part of what we'll be focusing on for the remainder of this workshop is what those two pieces look like in a 21st century context. De La Salle's method for interior prayer involves three movements. And for a really great description of these three movements in a little bit more detail and with some framing prayers that you can use to move between them, I would suggest looking at Way to Pray, which is on the Brothers Vocation blog, which is a really helpful resource in looking at these three movements. But a more boiled down way of looking at these three movements is that we begin by centering ourselves in God's presence, by saying, for instance, let us remember that we are in the holy presence of God, and taking that moment to center, to find that still point. The Way to Pray blog includes some other opening texts that you could use to center yourself for variation, or if that particular opening, let us remember, isn't what moves you spiritually. So the first movement is centering ourselves in God's presence. The second movement, as written in the method, is reflecting on sacred texts. That could be the daily gospel, that could be another scriptural passage that has meaning for you, that could be one of the reflective meditations or texts that De La Salle or another religious philosopher has written that connect you to the sacred. If you are not Christian, this text might be something from your own tradition that centers you in that sacred space, and that helps you build that dialogical connection with God, that conversation, that dialogue, that two-way interaction through the Spirit. The third movement, for me, is one of the most important components. It's bringing those prayerful insights back to the world. So if you look at the third movement of many of De La Salle's meditations, it's often full of questions. How might this connect to the lives of your students? How might this affect the way that you teach your classes? How might this affect the empathy that you have for the situations that your students are going through? How might this affect your community of brothers and the way that you interact in that community? It is a reminder to bring those prayerful insights back into the daily life that the early brothers are experiencing, and that we as 21st century Lasallians are bringing to our lives. And so this move outward, an inward move to center ourselves in God's presence, but then an outward move back into the world, is a really key component of this method of interior prayer. We are not staying interior. We are starting in an interior place to build that connection with God, and then we are taking that connection out into the world with us. And so when we say at the close of prayer, live Jesus in our hearts forever, part of what we are doing, it's the living part. How are we going to live this? Through our actions and our behaviors, and not just in our prayerful interior selves. Giving ourselves that time and that space for reflection can help us make that outward move. There are a number of different ways in which it can help us do that. So one way is in helping us surface key ideas. Interiority gives us the space for questions, for challenges, but also for the successes of our daily lives to percolate up from that daily chaos. Sometimes we spend so much of our cognitive load, our mental space, thinking through the problems and the challenges, that we don't give ourselves the space to acknowledge the successes. And that is an important component of interiority as well, to ask ourselves what went well, to try to stop that cycle of focusing on the things that are challenges, and to give us that space to be thankful for the things that are working well. And surfacing those key ideas is an important component of interiority. Interiority also helps us recenter ourselves, recentering ourselves in our relationship with God, but also giving us space to realign our internal compasses to our mission and to our vision instead of to our overflowing to-do lists. It's all too easy to get overwhelmed by all of the tasks that we have written down in front of us that have to happen before we go to bed, or that have to happen first thing in the morning, or that have to get checked off throughout every day. And so interiority helps to give us that space to say, how are these tasks aligned with my mission? How are these tasks aligned with our vision? And to help us evaluate those task lists to say which pieces are sort of experiencing mission creep now, that are beyond the scope of what my mission is calling us to do, or that are in fact actively pulling me away from mission-oriented activities, and to what extent, recognizing that sometimes our hands are tied, but to what extent can we refocus on those mission and vision aligned activities and tasks, and recentering our focus, our momentum toward those mission oriented activities. Interiority can also help us respond with grace. Taking that moment for interiority, finding that still point, gives us space to develop considered as opposed to reactive, and relational as opposed to individualized responses to challenges, particularly interpersonal challenges, in our association with our colleagues, in our association with our students, in our association with our students' families, so that rather than responding out of instinct, or rather than responding out of transaction with kind of a cold or scripted response, particularly when, for instance, a student is experiencing a challenge. One example particularly prevalent in this pandemic situation that we're in is for a student to come to us and say, well, I missed a deadline because the Wi-Fi went down, or someone in my household was sick, or my parent was an essential worker and I wasn't home to do the assignment, whatever it happens to be. That the transactional response or transactional reaction might be to say, well, you missed the deadline and there's nothing that I can do with that. But the relational response, responding with grace, taking that moment of interiority to say, how can I respond with empathy, allows us perhaps to make a different decision, or a different type of decision in the way that we respond to those that we are in association. Important component of interiority in the 21st century is that interiority is not one size fits all. So of course we do have a method of interior prayer given to us by the founder. And that is a method that works well, and I'm not suggesting that we abandon that method by any stretch of the imagination. But in the 21st century, we might find that we want to add to that method with techniques, methods, strategies that have come to us more recently, or that are fitting into our 21st century lives. So while the method for interior prayer focuses very much on a quiet, silent space, sitting in silence, it might be that for you or for me, interiority works best when you're jogging or doing yoga. It might be that you process best, you can reach that interior space best when you are writing instead of merely thinking. Perhaps you need music to reach your interior space, and that helps you find that still point. Perhaps, like me, you do well with interiority when you have what I call distracted hands. And so when I'm washing dishes, or doing some other sort of repetitive activity that doesn't require a lot of my cognitive thinking to, do a load of dishes, it frees up my brain space to achieve that interior space. I think it's also worth noting that in the diversity of the Lasallian world, there are people who are bringing interior methods from multiple faith traditions. And so while De La Salle models a method for interior prayer that is based in a Christian prayer tradition, some of us may be coming from other traditions and bringing our own interior processes for that. Some of us might prefer structured prayer through a rosary or through other prayer beads. Others might prefer the spontaneity of an unstructured prayer. There's not a right or wrong way to be interior. The goal here, and I think that the influence of De La Salle here is to say the interiority itself, whatever method you use to reach that point of dialogue with God, of turning inward, acknowledging God's presence, acknowledging the universe's presence, if you are a person who doesn't believe in God, and then turning inward and reflecting, and then turning outward. Those movements are the ones that matter. And whether you're doing that through jogging or through yoga or through washing dishes or sitting in that quiet space, taking that walk in the woods, whatever path you use to get there, the movements are the ones. Look at the beginning that we spend a lot of time in the Lasallian world talking about association, and we perhaps spend less time talking about interiority. And I do think that an important component of interiority is recognizing how it intertwines with association. Interiority is very much bound up in the idea of community, that we need both this interior space and the communal space to be effective Lasallian educators. And I just want to briefly call attention to the image. I chose this particular image. It's not explicitly a Lasallian image, although many of the thinkers here are people who influenced De La Salle. But I chose it because each early church father is individual, but they are also together in this tableau. And so I felt like it really underscored this idea of we need both interiority, but we also need to be together. Brother Timothy Caldwell wrote that God isn't unlike that distant stream we're seeking to draw closer to. Thinking about a walk in the woods and hearing through our interiority a distant stream that we are using our interiority to connect to. There is sound. It resembles a voice, but it's often imperceptible, whispery, hard to hear in all of the noise. And then what we hear is counterintuitive, as in one finds life through death, wisdom through folly, strength through weakness. I need help finding this stream and need to be with people who need the same help. The value of association when we are also investing in interiority is really critical. It allows us to note divergences in our interiority, to note convergences where we're coming together and we have some shared ideas, but having that sense of where we differ and where our interiority is leading us to different places, I think is also really important, as we are all trying to find that whispery, imperceptible voice. That voice may be leading each of us on slightly different paths, and that's okay. Brother Timothy continues that our ministries are in their own ways schools for interiority, schools of the spirit, where we help one another to pay attention to the imperceptible and whispery. There's a lot of noise to sift through, but right there in the middle of it is the voice worth following. And so we might need the encouragement of our associations to encourage us to invest in that interiority, to take that time. And one hopes, will take the insight that comes out of that prayerful interiority back into our associative relationships to deepen them as well. And so it's a system that reinforces each other on both ends. The interiority deepens our association, and our associations can help us find those points of interiority. So it's not a one or the other kind of proposition. It's a both together are making us stronger Lasallian educators. Think about the ways that interiority can support us as Lasallian educators in our 21st century Lasallian pedagogy. There are a couple of particular things that we might want to give some attention to. One is the ways in which we can model interiority for our students. They also are living in this 24/7 world, and teaching them to take a deliberate pause matters. Giving students methods for pausing and sometimes permission for pausing allows them the space to process the barrage. So teaching them, in Brother William Mann's words, that it's okay to slow down long enough and quietly enough, to be still enough, that the lovely power we call God might, with wisdom and serenity, gradually transform us into its own loveliness. That's a very powerful lesson for us to give them. And so finding ways to model this kind of interiority for them is a gift that will stay with them long beyond their time in our classrooms. Interiority can also support us as we develop deeper, richer, more reflective pedagogy. As we carve out time for meditation in de La Salle sense or in a more modern sense, it gives us a chance for our brains to shift and sort and triage the chaos of the day, to figure out what we might want to do differently next time, what worked really well and we should try again, what we want to ask a colleague about, what we need to just sit and be with for a while. And that with time, we are able to take some prayerful insights away from that interiority and bring it back into our classrooms, to make them deeper, richer learning experiences, even more deeply infused with Lasallian influences. We'll close, of course, with that moment of outward turning, um, by saying, St. John Baptist de La Salle, pray for us, live Jesus in our hearts forever. I hope that this was helpful for you. If you'd like to learn more about this, supplemental material from this workshop will be posted on becominglasallianeducators.com and will also be available through Dina. And if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to email me and I would be happy to share any of the resources that were used during the session, or to discuss interiority with you, which is something that has become very important to me as a legacy Lasallian. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.